It's Monday, March 14th. Keeping American troops out of Ukraine could be easier said than done. We start here. Russia's latest attack comes shockingly close to a NATO ally.
They're getting closer and closer to our NATO allies.
Our team was near the place where the rockets landed and where American veterans have begun showing up to fight. Meanwhile, Russia has begun kidnapping Ukrainian leaders.
He's been kidnapped. He's been disappeared by the occupying forces.
What it means for those at the top of Putin's list. And she worked for Child Protective Services, but then her colleagues were told to investigate her.
Medically necessary care cannot be child abuse.
What a judge's new ruling means for transgender kids and their parents. From ABC News, this is Start Here. I'm Brad Milkey. If you're dividing Ukraine into areas that are held by Russian troops and those that aren't, well, the spots held by the Russians are not huge. It's basically a big strip across the bottom near the Black Sea, a thin strip across the top near Belarus, and then this bulge coming down from the north, ominously close to the capital city of Kyiv. But just because those are the ones held by Russia doesn't mean they're the only ones getting attacked.
She says, we were driving down the main road and they just started shooting at us.
We
heard bombs next to our home, she says. The windows broke.
Now, as ruthless and horrific as some of these scenes have become, especially in the last several days, the position of the U.S. has remained clear. This is not our war. Ukraine is not a NATO country, so, the government says, we'll send supplies, but sorry, we're not conducting strikes of our own. We're not sending ground troops in.
Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III.
That would change if Putin hit a Western ally like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. These are all countries that share a border with Russia, and if Russia went to war with them, that means NATO is required to defend them. Poland sits just to Ukraine's west. If Russia went past that border into Poland, that is an assault on all of NATO. Well, yesterday morning, we got word that missiles have started landing about as close to one of those countries as you can get.
Russia expands its war to every part of Ukraine, striking a military training base less than 15 miles from the Polish border.
This new Russian attack was right near Poland, right on the western edge of Ukraine. The nearest large Ukrainian city there is Lviv, and that happens to be where we find ABC's chief global affairs correspondent Martha Radich this morning. So let's go straight to you, Martha. What can you tell us about this attack?
This was in the middle of the night. It was a training center. In fact, this is where Americans, before they pulled out of Ukraine, had been training some Ukrainian forces in the use of military equipment such as Stingers and Javelins. And they say there were 30 missiles that hit it. They said partly it was airstrikes. Some of the air defenses worked, according to the Ukrainians, but a really huge death toll. There were at least 35 people who were killed, 134 or more who were wounded. So this was a shock to wake up to, so close to Lviv, which has largely been spared. The western part of the country, most of Russian forces and missiles have been concentrating on the east and the north and the south. So this was a very cold wake-up call.
And can you just explain what all this might mean for NATO countries? Because just so I understand the rules, like if Poland feels like it's being attacked, does that mean the U.S. gets somehow essentially dragged into this?
I think that's exactly what the Russians are doing. They're getting closer and closer to our NATO allies. This was about 10 miles from the Polish border, and a very, very important border right now because obviously refugees are leaving. And what's going in is military and humanitarian supplies.
Doesn't this change the way you look at things? They're getting closer and closer to our NATO allies.
I can tell you that we have been consistently concerned about NATO's eastern flank and that airspace.
Senior officials I have spoken to say the fear really is that Russia might really test the U.S., might really test NATO, and hit some of that military equipment heading into Ukraine, but on the Polish side of the border.
We continue to flow and to move and to reposition forces and capabilities along NATO's eastern flank to make sure that we can defend every inch of NATO territory if we need to.
Are you willing to risk your life for this country?
Yeah, so I definitely think that fighting the war here is worth it because it keeps the war away from the home front.
Hey, Martha, if the U.S. government's worried it might have to send troops, it turns out there are Americans involved in this war in a sense, like sort of independent fighters. You spoke to some of these guys. Who are they?
I did, and Russia has now said that they targeted the military training center here near Lviv because there were so-called foreign fighters there. I just on Saturday had talked to many so-called foreign fighters and many Americans who are here in western Ukraine. It's a secret location.
Man, this took some time to clear out.
They certainly have to be on the Russian target list.
So these have all been dug in the last, I think, 6 days.
Really?
There was one Army veteran I spoke to who said as soon as he heard what was happening in Ukraine, he left his job as a Chicago police officer and headed over.
And when you say the right thing to do, what is it that you're fighting for?
We are fighting to make sure that the refugee crisis in Ukraine is nothing that we saw in Afghanistan.
They are, doing humanitarian work as well and trying to get refugees out.
But are you going to be in the fight?
Me personally, yeah. If it's needed, I'll be in the fight.
I told my wife when it starts, I'm going to go over there.
And there was a Navy veteran I spoke to who left his wife and 2-year-old son at home in San Diego and said he just had to come and fight for democracy.
I don't think big countries should just be able to pick on themselves. And I know some people might say, hypocrisy, U.S. military, whatever. That's fine. But I do think that these people have an established democracy, and that's something that should be defended.
He felt if he didn't fight here, if he didn't do his part, then this war would spread. So he wanted to help try and stop it.
And is there a sense that this could have groups like this, could this have an impact on the actual fighting, or is this negligible in the big scheme of things?
They certainly think so.
I can say that Putin doesn't know what's coming.
A tougher fight.
A very much tougher fight. We're going to see an exponential increase in numbers very, very shortly here.
But this is a whole group of people from all over the world who have never fought together. There are Albanians, Georgians.
We had guys from Japan, South Korea,
wow.
Italy,
Latvia, Lithuania.
We got a mix of nationalities through this for sure.
And it's kind of a ragtag band, but they are committed to the fight.
It's personal for you.
It already became personal when they bombed me when I was 3 months old in Albania. So if they want my gun, they can come and take it.
But, I think one of the reasons you've heard the Pentagon say, please don't come over, please don't volunteer for anything like this, is they know the Russians, if they were captured, would not treat them kindly. So,
and I'm kind of wondering, Martha, if it also gives Vladimir Putin an opportunity to tell the world, hey, we already got Americans here. Like, they're sending mercenaries to my part of the world. I have to keep my defense expanding westward.
He certainly could. He'd use any excuse to keep expanding this.
What do you think the next few weeks will look like?
They're going to be very hot for Ukraine. And unfortunately, we are going to see a lot of casualties among the civil population.
We'll have to watch in the coming days what kind of military facilities, if he continues to hit military facilities here in Western Ukraine. He has also said that they've got 16,000 volunteers to help them from the Middle East, including Syria. So you could have a mercenary fight going on very quickly. But I think what you will have, Brad, no matter what happens here, and you know that everyone I've talked to still feels that Putin will destroy Ukraine if he can. But if that happens and he gets control, he is going to have a very, very long guerrilla war in front of him.
All right, Martha Radich there in Lviv. Stay safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brad.
So that area where Martha's reporting from, that has not fallen. It's not really even encircled. But what happens when troops are there in your town knocking on the door? Well, the other big development over the weekend is that 2 different Ukrainian mayors have now vanished from the cities they've been running, reportedly kidnapped when they wouldn't bend the knee to Russian invaders. ABC's Patrick Reeville has been hunkered down in Kiev, which, again, still Ukrainian territory. But what are you hearing from these other parts of the country, Patrick?
Hi, Brad. Yeah. So basically, Russia's main advances, where they've had the most success, is down in the south, close to Crimea, and they've managed there to capture a few key cities. In particular, they captured one place called Melitopol. So they captured it almost immediately, and for the last 2 weeks, the mayor there has remained pro-Ukrainian, and he's been supporting protests. People have been coming out and marching past the Russian troops, confronting them, and chanting and waving Ukrainian flags and saying, "Go home, go home." And this mayor had been backing these protests. And over the weekend, he was kidnapped. He was taken by Russian forces from his office. We saw CCTV footage where he was taken away. He reportedly had a bag put over his head. And he was taken to these Russian separatist areas where he's now been charged with terrorism. And essentially, he's been kidnapped. He's been disappeared by the occupying forces. And in his place, we saw a lawmaker who was linked to a Russian party, a pro-Russian party. She appeared on television and gave an address where she said that a committee of the chosen will now run the city and that the protests must stop and that they're extremists. And essentially what we're seeing is Russia moving to try and break the resistance in these occupied cities. Ukraine's president came out and condemned it, and the US also came out and, essentially accused it of being another example of a war crime. But then the next day, another mayor disappeared from a smaller town. He's also disappeared, been kidnapped, it appears, by Russian forces. And they're not alone, Several pro-Ukrainian activists, people have been organizing these protests, and they're large protests, but several of these people have disappeared.
So that's two smaller cities, I guess, that have been captured already in southern Ukraine. But then my mind goes to the larger cities and the places around that country, and specifically to leaders like Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who said, "I'm not leaving." What has been the reaction from these cities and from places like Kiev, where Russian forces are growing closer and closer?
I think people are pretty horrified when they see it, because obviously that's exactly what occupation looks like. And I think there was a hope in some ways that Russia's intervention, which is what they were saying, was that they had political goals, but they wouldn't necessarily try and occupy all of Ukraine or large chunks of Ukraine.
Forcefully, he says he believes World War III has already started.
But clearly, and particularly in this city, I've been speaking to people in Melitopol, and they are very afraid that essentially Russia is moving now to permanently occupy them. And, I covered Crimea in 2014, and I saw this happen there. The Russians came in, and then anyone who was a prominent voice against the occupation and who tried to organize protests, they very quickly were disappeared. Some were arrested and charged. Others simply disappeared. A few people were found dead. Others were tortured. And I think the fear is that what we're watching right now is happening again in these occupied territories.
Yeah, and you got to think that image of men getting hustled away with bags over their heads, that is the image going through the minds of local leaders, people sticking close to these cities for now. Patrick Reevil in Kiev, still standing. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brad.
Next up on Start Here, top Texas officials call it child abuse. The children's doctors call it necessary. A judge weighs in after the break. We told you earlier this month how right before his primary, Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued a controversial order over transgender children.
Outrage grows over a move by Texas leaders to classify gender-affirming care as child abuse.
If this was about firing up the conservative voter base, well, it worked. He cruised to victory in his primary. But that order was not just about sending a message. It actually put some parents of trans kids in hot water with Texas Child Protective Services, meaning these parents could potentially have their children taken away from them.
The Texas Third Court of Appeals ruled there is no jurisdiction for these investigations to proceed.
Well, going into this weekend, a judge said investigations like this must be halted for now. So let's get into this with Eleanor Klibanoff. She's been covering this for the Texas Tribune. Eleanor, can you break down this case for me? Because it sounds like parents and the kid are on the same page. Their medical professionals are on the same page. It's the Texas government that said, you're abusing this child. Why?
That's right. So, the Attorney General, who was also in a very contentious primary, and he's actually going to a runoff, he sort of kicked this off by issuing this non-binding legal opinion that equated gender-affirming care with child abuse. And Governor Greg Abbott sort of followed that up by turning the power of the CPS system in Texas on these families who provide this care, like you said, in consultation with a doctor to their transgender, in most cases, teenagers.
It puts providers in an incredibly difficult situation and an ethical dilemma. And it is legislation dictating treatment.
The state has confirmed there are at least 9 open investigations into parents, just in a matter of weeks.
He's trying to scare families, which is working. We're scared. He's trying to get us to leave Texas, which some of us are.
These families, I've talked to many of them and their lawyers, and they are just absolutely terrified. It's just complete panic amongst them. To have CPS show up at your home or at your child's school interviewing them. Many of them described feeling really terrorized by this.
Anybody who's a parent, who has ever been a parent, knows that the best thing that they can do is support and love their child.
Since this directive went into effect in late February, we've seen a lot of protests at the state capitol, at the governor's mansion. We've seen Department of Family and Protective Services, their committee meeting was basically taken over by people sharing their public comment.
I was born in Texas and I have a business here. It makes me feel physically ill to imagine having to flee this state.
In a lot of cases, actually, people reading comments on behalf of families that were actually even too scared to show up in person, fearing that they might actually face an investigation just for speaking out.
And so then what was the ruling, I guess, Friday going into this weekend? How did that affect things?
Yeah, so this was actually a pretty huge ruling for the ACLU and Lambda Legal, who had brought a lawsuit on behalf of one family who was facing one of these investigations. And it's actually an interesting case. A woman who works for the Child Protective Services here in Texas, and she has a transgender teenager. And when this directive came down from the governor, she started asking her supervisor about how they plan to implement this, both because she needed to know professionally and because she was concerned about her family. And almost immediately, she was put on leave from her job, and CPS showed up at her door to interview her family, and, they opened an investigation.
For him to call us the child abusers is such a betrayal.
The lawyers had managed to get a temporary restraining order stopping just that one investigation from going forward. The ruling on Friday extended that injunction statewide. And it was a very sweeping injunction from this Austin area judge who basically said, none of these investigations can proceed. You can't open new investigations. No one can be prosecuted for child abuse under this. And her ruling said, this will remain in place until this court hears this hears this case, until the Court of Appeals hears this case, and until the Texas Supreme Court hears this case, which was sort of a nod to how hard fought this is going to be and how much this is not over.
The Texas government's position seems to be, listen, it's not that you can't be on board with your kid being trans. It's not that you can't tell your kid, I love you. It's that you shouldn't be encouraging them to get hormone therapies. You shouldn't be encouraging them to get surgeries, that these are all very permanent measures to a developing child in something that's going to be, gender in the context of this conversation can be fluid. So why would you get this kind of medical intervention so early that is such a big deal for this kid? You've spoken to more experts than I have about this. Is that essentially the message the government's trying to send to these families?
That is what they are saying, yes. And they cite a lot of really different evidence than folks on the other side cite.
If these are going to be procedures someone wants to pursue, that they would pursue them when they were mature enough to understand it.
Much of what we're talking about here with teenagers is puberty blockers, which are completely reversible, and hormone therapy, which does have some side effects, but generally pretty superficial side effects.
The scientific community is in one voice, in lockstep, that this is not child abuse, that medically necessary care cannot be child abuse.
Some of the rhetoric around this talks about children, as young as 3 or 4 being given these treatments. And in almost all cases, you can't give a child who is not approaching or in puberty blockers. So there's really no medical treatment that can really even be offered to a child before they are approaching puberty.
It makes me sad that some politicians use trans kids like me to get votes from people who hate me just because I exist.
Much of what children and teenagers even are offered if they are trans is what we call social transition, which is, being allowed to basically just live your life as the gender you identify with.
Oh, like the teacher tells the class from now on, this is how it's working.
Exactly. Or you wear, if you want to wear dresses, wear dresses. If you want to if these are the pronouns you want to use, we'll use those pronouns. that's the vast majority of what we're facing, of what, these children are experiencing.
So then what's next for this order? Because this judge's ruling, that's a temporary thing. No investigations for now.
Right. So Attorney General Ken Paxton has already appealed the judge's order, and he has said on Twitter that he believes that these investigations actually can proceed while the appeal is being heard. Lawyers for the plaintiffs have said that they don't believe that is true. There seems to be a lot of confusion about whether the injunction will hold during that appeal process. And really what it'll come down to is what the states, what the lawyers for Child Protective Services decide is the safest bet, basically. So we're not entirely sure. But this ruling was a largely very positive step for the families of these transgender children who are facing investigation.
All right, that is Eleanor Klibanoff from the Texas Tribune. Thank you so much. Really clarifying.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, if you want to win your March Madness pool, leave your glass slippers in the locker room. One Last Thing is next.
You start your day with Start Here. Start your week with This Week.
Good morning and welcome to This Week.
I'm George Stephanopoulos. Every Sunday, we invite the biggest names in politics to discuss the most pressing issues of our time.
So did his strategy work against you?
I don't think so. We go beyond the headlines, push past the spin to get to the core of the stories that impact you and our country. If you missed This Week on TV Sunday morning, check out the podcast version of the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And one last thing.
Here we go. March Madness!
Last night, the NCAA basketball tournament brackets were revealed on CBS and ESPN. And even if you're not a sports ball person, you likely now have a chance to win bragging rights or even a friendly wager with your friends, unless you're me every year for the last decade. Okay, Neil. I'm very bad at March Madness brackets. I like to think that I know what I'm talking about with sports, but apparently I don't. What am I doing wrong?
Well, do you pick based on mascots? I've seen people do that, and it doesn't have the best success rate.
Okay, there goes option one. Right. It's Neil Payne from our partners at 538, and he's agreed to be a secret weapon for you, for me, and anyone who enters office pools without even knowing most of the teams.
And the dirty secret is, most people don't know much about these teams.
First of all, he offers a simple mantra. Your job, he says, is not to fill out a perfect bracket.
I think the odds of that, the oft-quoted number is 1 in 9.2 quintillion, but we did a story a couple years ago where if you picked the 538 favorite, you'd have a 1 in 2 billion chance of getting a perfect bracket.
Starting tomorrow, everyone's going to be telling you about the crazy upsets they're predicting. Later this weekend, you're going to feel left out because they somehow managed to pick Delaware over Villanova. Ignore them. You play the early rounds for pride. Neil says you play the Final Four for keeps.
Ohio State has no timeouts remaining.
We think about March Madness. We have this idea of it being so crazy and unpredictable and all of that. And certainly there are upsets in the first round.
Oral Roberts has pulled off the upset.
But you can chase those first round upsets and then find yourself eliminating teams that really will come in handy and most likely will go deep into the tournament later on.
The overall #1 seed, Gonzaga.
With that in mind, 538 has put out a model listing each team's chances of making each round and which team is most likely to win the whole thing.
We have Gonzaga as the overall favorite to win.
Another West Coast Conference championship for the Gonzaga Bulldogs.
We give them a 27% chance, followed by Kansas at 10%.
And the Jayhawks secure the Big 12 championship.
And Kentucky and Arizona at 8% apiece.
Just like their political forecast, they run millions of simulations to figure out which stats actually matter. Among them are not only wins and losses, but offensive efficiency, injuries, and travel schedule. Bottom line, he says, pick the top-ranked teams to go farther, even if your friends call you boring. Then get bold in the later rounds to collect your prize. I'm getting the inside scoop on all my coworkers this year. Watch out. If you look at this 538 model, by the way, Kentucky actually has this great chance to win, even though they're a 2 seed. That's a tip right there for you. 538 also has all the same gadgets for the women's tournament. South Carolina is the favorite there. Hey, if you think we're the 5-star recruit of your podcast lineup, hit us up with a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. I'm Brad Milkey. See you tomorrow.
Take America's #1 news with you anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now.